Welcome, everybody. Here is our next series in workshops about teamwork and building efficient teams. Our guest speaker today and our expert on teamwork is Dr. Sharon Hewner, who is a professor in the School of Nursing at UB and one of my favorite collaborators. That we work on several projects together that end up using a lot of team-based principles and strategies. And so today I would like Dr. Hewner to tell us about her experience and her strategies, how to make research team productive, effective, and conflict-free, if that's even possible. But before we start, Dr. Hewner, please tell us about your background and your project that you would like to share with us today and your partners.
Oh, sure. I am a registered nurse and have been for 50 years now. So I have worked in a variety of different kinds of clinical settings, and I think that gives me a background across the healthcare system that's kind of unusual. My PhD actually, though, is in anthropology, and so I bring a little bit different perspective to how we work with teams and groups of people than you might find other places. The project that we're doing is sort of the culmination of 15 years of work here in Western New York, trying to improve communication with hospitals and primary care centers at the time of discharge from the hospital. And that's based on my observation that so often people are sent home very early from the hospital and suffer needlessly with rehospitalizations, with not knowing what medications to take, with coming up with complications that could have easily been prevented. So that work is really trying to eliminate that, especially for populations with high social and medical need.
Fantastic. Fascinating work, Dr. Hewner. Thank you very much for including me in that. We're talking today about primarily research teams. So clinical care is complex, but doing research in clinical settings is even more complex because, as we often say, you can't stop playing to fix it. So while all this care is going on, and you have a privilege to wear in both hats. You are a clinician and you are a researcher, but a lot of our faculty are only one or the other. And so that's why we're really looking to learn from your experience. So tell us about the team. So how did you select this team and this different stakeholders to help you approach your goal and also to deliver it within the restrictions of the federal grant funding?
So I think I'll start talking first about our partners to give some context for where we're trying to work. So my work is focused in federally qualified health centers. They offer a wide range of care, including maternal health, pediatrics, general medicine, in high-need populations or rural areas. There's a number of them across the 8-county region of Western New York. So I am working specifically with Jericho Road, and the other clinical practice sites that we're working in are Spectrum Health and Behavioral Services, because we were really interested in people who have both physical healthcare needs and also mental health care needs. And then I've also been working with the Buffalo City Mission, looking at people who have extremely high social needs. And much of the work that I do is sort of propelled by the health information exchange that's shared with HealthyLink, which is a regional health information organization here in Western New York. The research team is also very diverse. We have PhD prepared faculty, doctoral students, administrative support, and we represent the professions of nursing, social work, physical therapy, implementation science, industrial and systems engineering, and computer science engineering. And Dr. Noyes is part of our team. The team itself, though, that broad team, is divided into two sections. that overlap a lot. But the two sections are, one is really dealing with the technical aspects and the data analysis phase of things. And then the other team really forms what I would call our implementation resource team. I would be the leader of that. And then we have people who are expertise in implementation science. That's Dr. Noyes. Systems engineering is Dr. Sabrina Casucci from Industrial and Systems Engineering. Social work is Dr. Elizabeth Bowens. And we also have a project coordinator who's really integral to this whole process as far as making the outreach calls and getting consents and doing all of those kinds of things. And then PhD students in nursing who are largely involved in direct data collection and working directly with the practices.
All right.
So that's the team. How do we work together is another question. Should I jump right into that?
Well, so let me make sure I understand correctly, and our audience also captures that. So within the research team, there is a kind of, you call them research implementation team. So this to me sounds like a team that's doing internal management and teamwork and implementation within a broader research team, right? So it's almost that you need a machinery to run your research team, and that's your machinery, that team. So how is maybe the better way to describe it is, how is the structure of this project different from what we consider a normal research study team? And you've done numerous research projects. So what was unique about this study that made you think that you really need that implementation resource team?
So I think that we definitely knew that we needed to have the technical expertise on how to just move information from one place to another. And so Dr. Casucci would have been working directly with the sort of database managers in all of the clinical sites, and also working then with HealthyLink on how do we get information back and forth, and how do we make this a really efficient process. We needed to bring in additional expertise on social need and homelessness, which is where Dr. Bones came in, and she's been working really intensively with our students who are interviewing and being on site with all of the different patients and providers that we work with. The work with providers, that's really something that I led. We worked very closely with a PhD student who sat in on all of our meetings. We had all of the transcripts of those meetings. They did specific interviews, and then they analyzed those interviews. So we really worked intensively in thinking about how is that implementation team working together, and how do they feel about the whole process. We included the research team as part of that. And the central piece of the whole project is sort of this health information exchange that creates electronic enhanced care alerts that go out to the primary care practice at the time when patients are discharged from the hospital.
Yeah, so it sounds to me that what's different between this study and most traditional way how we do research is not only you had research aims, you also spend a lot of time planning the process, how and when and by whom those aim and research activities will be delivered to maximize success and minimize disruption to healthcare, right? Because we need to think about that all the time, that we do in research, but they are doing their jobs while helping us do research.
Yes.
And so maybe you can share a couple examples where that really introduced a difficulty or maybe even a conflict, that the disconnect between what the research team needed to do and what clinical team were willing and able to do given the constraints of their jobs.
So I have both some challenges and also some unexpected bonuses. I think one of the bonuses that we had was the primary care practice had actually implemented a cohort table, which is what drives our whole system, in their practice at the time when we started the project back in 2020. So we worked with them on adapting their current cohort table to match the definitions of conditions that we used. We gave them additional definitions, and we worked with them to think about how can we incorporate social determinants of health, and especially the health-related social needs, into their system. That then we had to figure out how to get that to HealthyLink. So what we did is then develop a technical mechanism to send that over. So that was challenging. It was a new system that had to be developed. But HealthyLink was really, we tried to model it exactly on the way that they have sent their roster of patients to HealthyLink, so that it was not needing all new kinds of interventions. Now, one of the challenges was at HealthyLink, helping them to create the cohort table for all of their population, right? So the cohort table just looks at about 27 different medical conditions. It gives them the data definitions for those, and then they build that into their system so that they can identify anyone across the 8 counties who is a high-need patient. So that was a challenge, and that was us. One of the first things that we ran into problems with is really figuring out how to get that exchange going. And then I think another challenge that occurred was how to bring data from multiple different sources into HealthyLink to create the information that we needed for the care alert. So that was a big challenge for them. And I think, when we did interviews with people, all of the different participants, they were like, this is never going to work. This is so crazy. It's going to take all of these resources, and it's really going to be very problematic. And so we had multiple meetings where we would sit down and say, well, okay, here's one piece that we need. How can we do this? And we just broke it down into one little piece, one little piece, one little piece. We had them bring the area deprivation index data in from wherever that's stored, I can't remember. We had them bring that in. We had them bring in zip codes. We had them identify who were living in rural areas. So they had to bring in a lot of extra information, and then they had to figure out how to deliver that into an electronic message that could be sent in real time when the person was discharged from the hospital. So there were challenges on the technical side, and there were challenges on the social side as well. So while we were working with the practice, they had major turnover in the practice at one point. That really meant we had to sort of step back, try to be really supportive, try to think about ways to make the process easier for them to get over that hump. And I think a lot of it was developing trust with them. How do we make it possible for you to do really good work without sounding like we were criticizing what they were doing? And I think many times in the meetings that we were involved with, I would say, you guys are the experts on how to do transitional care. All I'm asking you is, how can I make your job easier? How can I present you with the information that you need to do a better job? And how can I make sure that it's accessible and it's going to take you less time and that you're talking to the right patients? And that was a hard concept, because typically in healthcare, what you find is that CMS or somebody will say, oh, we have to call everybody who's been discharged from the hospital within 72 hours to make sure that they have transportation. And so primary care practitioners are scrambling to call everyone, and at least 80% of those people probably do not need a phone call. So it was really trying to make them feel comfortable that if they focused their most intensive resources on the limited number of people who we thought were likely to have high needs, that it would be more productive overall. And so, but that is a hard concept to sell. And I'm sure on the clinical side, people were totally skeptical that it would ever make any difference. So
Yes,
Sorry,
that's an
Ekaterina.
incredible story. Thank you very much for sharing, Dr. Hewner. So what I've heard is uh, that you use one very powerful strategy, that you did not come to those partners, these are really your community partners, as an expert. You didn't tell them, let me show you what you should do better. And that's what many times we do in research. We are academics. We have multiple letters after our names. So we go to our community partners and trying to teach them, and that usually backfires. So I really like your approach of asking them, even though I'm pretty sure you knew from your research and clinical experience what needs to be done better, but you can open a conversation with this. Let me tell you what to do. You tell them, how can I help you? And I think that was brilliant, and that clearly led to very positive results. The other observation that I noticed from you describing it, so you actually sought feedback from your stakeholders, not from the patients we enroll. We always analyze the patients or participants, but it sounds to me that you were also asking for regular feedback from your stakeholders, understanding how they feel about the research process. And I think that's highly innovative, because we're always so busy, we don't have time to talk about how we think things are going. We're so focused on deliverables. And the other interesting strategy that I noticed is that this idea that when you're describing your Healthy Link partners, so they are data partners, they do all of those things. And yet, your team was helping them identify data and tables and all of the technical information where you really not an expert. The data domain and their data systems is their expertise. And yet, because you understood something they didn't know, you were able to help them with their job. Sort of, to me, that's really a foundation of teamwork, that nobody on the team can complete the task alone. Everybody depends on somebody else on the team for help, expertise, or support. And I think that example illustrates beautifully that concept, that if Healthy Link could have done all this, they would have done it before, right? But they couldn't. They really needed you as a researcher and your clinical partners to make that pivot. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about teams.
So I really loved the interviews that we did with providers. It was a very simple interview, 6 questions, basically. So tell me how you think the projects are going, what's going well, what's not going so well, all this kind of stuff. And we asked them every 6 months across the course of the research. And so they really were minimally invasive for people. And you could just really see how things changed over time. But what was interesting is the process was changing asynchronously. So at the beginning of the project, we're working intensively with the health information exchange and with the primary care, looking at their data to try and see where we could work with things. And there was much less role for the behavioral health team, but the city mission was almost completely outside of that process. And so what we had to do is sort of engage everybody up front at a very high level. So we had a number of workshops where we brought all sorts of people from these different organizations in for Zoom meetings because it was the pandemic. And they got a chance to sort of see the other perspective, even though they weren't currently going to be involved. And what happened is that it was a struggle the first time we implemented this at the primary care practice. There's no question about that. But when we went to implement it at the second practice, it was like super easy. I mean, it was no big deal. We turned on the alerts. We figured out that there was one thing that was causing a problem. We fixed that one thing, and they went ahead, and it's like it's been running seamlessly ever since then. But it was weird because the whole time when we're doing these interviews, they're saying, well, we don't understand what this is going to do. And I don't think it's going to make any difference. And this is so weird. I don't know why we're having these interviews all the time. And that was the kind of feedback you were getting. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, this really helps us. We love this, and it really saves the nurses time. And it's so much more efficient. And it's like, okay, great, wonderful. Thank you so much for that feedback. But yeah, it's hard it's hard for them to visualize the difference it could make. But keeping them involved and letting them see that other organizations were struggling along the way, I think was also really helpful for them as far as implementing it themselves, because they could sort of think ahead of how they were going to arrange getting the phone calls to the right nurses, right? How are they going to manage that? And how would it work with their electronic health record? So it was fun. It is fun.
Interesting. So that actually, to me, is an illustration of another concept from implementation science, what we call readiness to change, that's been cited many times, that what's hard with implementation is that not everybody desires implementation, or not everybody desires the same change. And I think your example of hearing from your partners, why are we doing this? I don't need this. This is not going to happen. That's a sign that you were able to engage with stakeholders who were not ready for change yet. They were not prepared for that. And perhaps they trust you because that's what they engaged, but they didn't trust the process. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you were able to move them along that continuum of readiness to change from, no, I don't believe it's a good thing, to, oh my God, we're doing it and it's actually doing something wonderful, that is an incredible progress for a working team. Because most investigators, let's admit it, you start with people who already want to work with you, who are already believers and already your supporters. And that's wonderful for a research project, but it makes it very difficult for real world implementation, because in real world, not everybody's supporting, not everybody trusting, and that creates this disconnect between what you can publish in a journal versus what you can do in a real life. And my gut feeling that this intervention will be relatively easy to implement because it's been vetoed by so many different stakeholders in various stages of their readiness that I feel that you will be ready to address any concerns or any pushback.
Well, I think it's been interesting too, thinking about what kinds of populations of people we want to target. How do we modify the current system so that we can really address the unique needs of new moms and their babies, and how do we help them? How do we help the system help them better, right? And so I think that that was not necessarily expected, that we would be able to translate this then into the clinical component. And so one of the things that I get on a soapbox about is we so often discount the knowledge that nurses have about how things work in the system and where there are opportunities to do things in a different kind of way. So we always kind of get these from above kinds of directives that we're going to manage things. And it's like, but it really understanding what's happening on the ground in the clinical, you really have to have that nursing perspective. Because we're really close to patients, like we see them all the time. And that long-term relationship is really important in bringing together interventions that are really going to make a difference. So I think that you need to have the clinical expertise at a very ground level, being part of this from the beginning in order to make this work. And so, whether it's doulas that you're going to be working with or community outreach workers or whatever, really thinking about who are the people who know what the big problems are in delivering of care and in keeping people healthy. That part is so essential, and we skip over that too often. So I'll get off the
I agree with you. Yes, no. And I mean, many folks probably don't know that the foundational principles of implementation science and teamwork have been developed 30, 40 years ago in nursing practice. And we kind of forgotten about it until it got reintroduced to the clinical practice and research practice. And now we say that it's highly innovative, but some of the early papers been published in the 80s and 90s. So nurses and social workers contributed enormously to making implementation science a science as opposed to something you do on a unit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much for sharing this, Dr. Hewner. Was there anything else about this project that you think stood out as a generalizable practice that you plan to use over and over again in your other projects?
Well, I think that the basic principle of trying to make things easier for the provider is really foundational, right? If we can just think about what are we trying to accomplish and how could we make that work more smoothly? Most times in clinical practices, people are really good about coming up with fixes, like a short-term fix to whatever the problem is. And you get these things and you then have this extraordinarily complex system. And it's like, this is relatively simple. If we could just give you the information that you need to make a phone call so you don't have to spend an hour trying to find from all of these different sources the same information, then we've made your job a lot easier. We've made care better. We've improved patient outcomes without you really feeling any pain at all outside of the initial implementation. So what was interesting after our pilot project is that when we finished and showed people the results, suddenly the regular alerts got turned on across the 8-county region with us doing nothing, right? Now, they did not implement the targeting of the high-risk population, and they did not implement using nurses to make the outreach phone calls. So I don't know if their results have been the same, but the technical piece was very easy to do. And I think that my goal with this current project is to really bring the message home. You need to have that ability to decide which patients need the outreach and really allow the experts to work with them uninterrupted with making phone calls to check about transportation, right? That's where we need to think about how do we use the resources that are already there in primary care more effectively. So those would be my thoughts.
Very interesting. So given that all of this research has been happening in a very challenging times, you started in the pandemic, then we had various changes in research funding and healthcare delivery environment and shortages of nurses. What recommendations do you have for researchers who are planning and proposing studies in this constantly changing environment? How do you adapt and yet deliver high fidelity work that is reproducible and publishable and generalizable, while the reality of healthcare delivery is always on the move?
It's a challenging problem. I think that for me, working very closely with HealthyLink and all of the partners that they have. So I also sit on an advisory board at HealthyLink, and just being able to listen to what kinds of issues are coming in to them and really thinking about how do we blend what we're doing here at the university with what they're doing. So not trying to take it over, which I think sometimes it can happen. I think with the proprietary electronic health records, I think they kind of own things and then you can't change them and you can't modify them. But to me, it's the flexibility that you can get by working closely with a partnering organization to really customize to what's happening in your region, what are the problems that you have there. And I think that we, at least right now with AHRQ being sort of on the shelf right now, really thinking about how do we build with these community partners and offer our suggestions and get their help. We've had a very collaborative relationship with HealthyLink. It's not like I'm buying data from them and I'm not, would do whatever. But I also am very freely sharing my data definitions and very freely telling them, here's, I think, a clinical encounter that would really make sense. Do you have some people who would be interested in this? How can we do this? So that's the kind of thing that I think is going to continue to move this forward because I think it's needed. The healthcare system is, I think, even more fragmented than, and we complained about it for forever, but I think it's more fragmented now than it ever was before. And that's problem.
Unfortunately, yes. But it sounds like the trust that you develop with those partners, and also by inquiring about their challenges, I think it helps to bring everybody on the same page about goals and visions. So researchers are informed about translational questions in the community, and community probably better understands research methodology, that we have to have a protocol, we have to have deliverables, right? Which
We'll have
may
to
not
do
necessarily.
and you'll be sorry about that, I'm sure, many days. So,
Yeah.
But I think that it's the multiple different touch points that helped. We had formal meetings, we had workshops, we had, quick phone calls, we had these student interviews being done. We also worked very closely with the patient population. But I felt that was outside of the realm of what our main scope was here. There's no reason for patients to necessarily know that they're part of a research study in this particular case. Although any of the interviews that we did, they were all had informed consent and everything. But I suspect most of them had no idea that there was an alert that came from the hospital. So.
Yeah, that's a beautiful part for me to do in system level research, that the burden to patients is really minimal.
As it should be.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hewner. Really appreciate your experience and sharing with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.